thank everyone for coming to our meeting today. This is one of a series of meetings that the Freedom Party has been having in various local communities around London and the area. We had another one last night in Byron, another one in Wortley a couple of nights before that. And we've had small groups that we just got together. We discussed our perspective on the Charlottetown proposals and field of questions and answers and other people's perspectives on the issue, which we'll be free to do as soon as I've wrapped up here. So I think fundamentally, to get right to the point and right to the full Charlottetown agreement, this is what we're being asked to vote on, not on whether we want Canada to remain a united nation or whether, it's not a unity question in that sense. The word unity does appear once in the Charlottetown proposal, right here in the headline, unity and diversity. But if you read every clause that follows after that headline, I think you'd have to come to the conclusion that each of these clauses would lead to disunity and further factionalization of the Canadian mosaic. I think one of the most important aspects of being a member of a united country, and this is my perspective here, I think comes from the knowledge and understanding that each individual from coast to coast has the same rights, the same freedoms, and the same responsibilities. I think it's comforting to know that as citizens of one nation, we can count on having the same rights, freedoms, and responsibilities, regardless of where we may live geographically within the boundaries of that nation. I think it's comforting to know that we have the same rights, responsibilities, and freedoms, regardless of who we are within that nation, regardless of our religious, our ethnic, our racial backgrounds, or our basic beliefs. I think fundamental to a free society is the right of citizens to disagree with one another and to maintain an arm's length distance as a consequence of that disagreement. And ideally, I think I would say that each citizen should be able to know in a free society just exactly what the limits of his or her government are. How far can your government go in terms of infringing upon your rights or denying you certain choices? And exactly where does your government's authority end? And furthermore, I think each individual should have legal protection from their own government. Now, these are just some of the fundamental reasons why I am opposed to the Charlottetown Accord. I think this makes the country, or defines our country on virtually terms exactly the opposite of what I've just described. I think if you took everything that I just said and put an opposite twist on that, that will have special classes of people in Canada, that will have special privileges, more division, more government levels, I think that is the proposal that we're seeing spelled out for us here. So it's very important to realize to begin with that this is not an agreement. It's a 60-clause basis for continued negotiations and discussions. And in a sense, that's what the important issue is that this is the basis on which future discussions are planned to take place. So in other words, if someone wants to approach the future constitutional conferences who has something in mind a little bit different than what's outlined in here, that person is likely to get less of a hearing or not be entertained at all in the sense of it's already been agreed that Canada will be discussed on this basis. It's definitely not a unity question. This is one of the big things that has really bothered me about constitutional debate in the referendum since the beginning. If we vote yes, that's for a unified Canada, we're told. And if we vote no, then Canada faces major problems of division. Well, this is simply not the case. The whole Charlottetown proposal is all about division. Literally. They're dividing up the powers between the provinces. They're telling us which provinces get to have special powers and authorities and privileges. And it's also about the vision of the country. We're even creating, by the way, other levels of government, which haven't been very clearly defined within the agreement. And of course, as we probably are all aware by now, this is an agreement arrived at by politicians. It certainly gives the politicians themselves a lot more say in the future of the country. And I consider it as well as a blueprint for laws that divide and disunify the country. Quite to the contrary, I would suggest that if you do want to live in a unified country, that you're almost obligated to vote no to this particular consensus. Some of the arguments that we've heard, in terms especially of the yes side, I'll add a few others. You know, we've heard the argument, for example, that this deal offers self-government rather, for Aboriginal groups and Métis groups. Well, that's simply not the case. This is not self-government, certainly not the way that I would define self-government. If we take a look, we will see under sections 4C50, 4C51, and 4C56, and I quote, "The Accord would commit federal and provincial governments to the principle of providing the governments of Aboriginal peoples with fiscal and other resources such as land." So right away we're being told that this native self-government isn't self-government at all. It will be a government set up and administered and paid for by the provincial and federal governments outside the jurisdiction of the native self-government. In fact, we've already been warned that a consequence of this clause will be that native groups will be able to expropriate land and have the same kinds of political powers that many municipality and other political entities within our society have. We also see section 51, the Constitution should include a provision which authorizes governments of Aboriginal peoples to undertake affirmative action programs for socially and economically disadvantaged individuals and groups and programs. So not only is this government going to be set up, it is going to be obligated to, in effect, implement a welfare state within the native people. Now this is a far cry, I think, from anything that we could call preserving native people's culture or tradition. Because if this is what their culture and tradition is, I don't know who could possibly have interpreted this that way. And of course, we get another section where the Accord commits governments to negotiate cost-sharing arrangements with all of these groups. So on the one hand, we're going to see a situation where both sides in this equation are again going to be further divided. We're going to see, if this were carried out, the taxpayers and the provincial and federal governments who are obligated to finance this, resentful for the fact that they have to do that in the first place, and then we're going to see the native groups very resentful of the fact that they're going to be dependent upon these outside resources, which simply aren't there. We're already dealing with governments federally and provincially that don't have any more resources to distribute since they're already deep in debt. So self-government for Aboriginals, a far cry from it. This is more control of Aboriginals. And I think this is one of the reasons I think a lot of the native peoples across the country are already poised to reject this. I think that some of them are forward thinking enough that they can see that this would be the ultimate consequence of accepting some of these clauses. It's a little frightening too, you know, another argument we hear a lot is that this is going to create an equal and elected and effective Senate. I mean, this simply, again, is not the case. In fact, in the Senate, we already know that Francophone senators get what is called, and has been literally declared, called a double majority. In any issues dealing with French culture or French language, Francophone senators can have a separate vote on top of the regular vote in the Senate, which can override whatever the result of the first vote was. For example, section 2A14, on entering the Senate, senators should be required to declare whether they are Francophones for the purpose of the double majority rule. Now you can see by creating a special privilege or a special status of this nature, very soon we're going to see other groups wanting the same kind of status to protect their little clique of interests. And they're going to also want to have a double majority or what have you to balance that power off. It's just going to happen that way, particularly when you take into account the fact that our politicians are saying, oh yeah, we can change this Constitution in the future, we can improve upon it. Well, if they're going to change it and improve upon it based on these clauses, then that's the only direction they can go in. We're just going to see group after group after group lining up and asking for all these special privileges. Again, we're talking about, you know, representation, more proportional representation. This is less, especially when you guarantee one province out of 10 a 25% minimum number of seats in the House of Commons. Now, a number of people have already quite accurately figured out that if Quebec's population for some reason were to fall to, say, 5,000 people or something like that, they'd still be guaranteed 25% of the seats in the House of Commons. What kind of conflict might that create between what will be regarded or felt as being the ruled majority by the ruling minority. That's almost a situation that people will start to sense. I don't see this as a formula for unity, definitely not. Another interesting argument that was brought forth. Quebec needs protection. And I think here we get down to more fundamental issues. What does Quebec really need protection from? We constantly hear, and in this accord it says, and always puts together, that Quebec constitutes within Canada a distinct society which includes a French-speaking majority, a unique culture, and a civil law tradition. Now, as I've been pointing out through this whole campaign, I say that the issues of French tradition and culture and language are not the issues here. What is the issue here is the civil law tradition that we see that they keep talking about. It comes up in a lot of clauses. For example, even under Section 2B18, the Constitution should entrench the current provision of the Supreme Court Act, which specifies that the Supreme Court is to be composed of 9 members, of whom 3 must have been admitted to the civil law bar of Quebec. Now, this is a very fundamental thing. This is what Quebec wants to protect. Is its right, basically, under civil law code in which its citizens generally, whatever freedoms and liberties they have, are granted to them, quote, by the government, which is in stark contrast to the common law British code, where government governs with the consent of the governed, and it's also referred to as the bottom up. And what specifically Quebec is asking to do in this case is to have the right to override certain provisions of the Charter that protect all citizens' rights. In other words, what's happening here is that we're almost putting into our Constitution an exception to the Constitution so that one province can ride around it. They can now continue to tell certain groups within the Quebec borders, for example, that they can't put an English sign on their private property. Now, if they had their individual rights protected as guaranteed to them in the Charter, this would be a clear case where the Charter should override the civil code, and where individuals should know that he's been protected by his federal government from the encroachments of his provincial governments. And I think that's really what a basic constitution should be all about. It should be a charter of the citizen's protection against his own government. That's as far as a basic constitution and charter should really go. Beyond that, you're just talking about administration and how various governments will conduct their affairs. And really, that's not a major issue. There could be a lot of leeway. And Quebec could continue to operate with a civil code so long as that provision were in place, that where the civil code conflicted with the basic Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it should be the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that takes precedence. Too often, we find Canadians going to the Supreme Court, trying to fight for a right or freedom that is explicitly spelled out for them in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, only to find that, yes, indeed, their rights have been trampled upon and their rights have been violated, but that it is, quote, democratically justifiable. So what kind of protection can you have if you can't even count on something that's being called fundamental within a constitution? I mean, that word fundamental means from which the rights accrue and from which all other responsibilities and even our laws should be based on. If these aren't fundamental, then they're conditional. That's the only choice we have. We either have fundamental rights, which are inalienable and belong to everyone, or we have conditional rights, which are prescribed to us by others. And this is basically what the whole Charlottetown Accord prescribes, is that kind of a Canada. We brought our own solutions to the Canadian government back in April 1991, and our complete verbatim transcript of the proceedings are in the back of this, in the back before the people. And I think one thing that you will find when you read that is how adamant, even at that time, and it was almost just like an open and shut case, you could not bring up to this government the idea that individual rights should come first and government rights should be second. They just weren't interested in hearing that. And perhaps with some degree of justification, in the sense that the irony here is that the very protection that Quebec wants, if it were being serious about its language and culture, would never be a threat in the first place if individual rights were in place. Because individual rights already tell us no government may infringe upon our basic freedom of association and our own culture and our belief and conscience. Now, if we actually upheld this, would Quebec be an issue? It shouldn't be. So in our solution, we provided that in order to have a citizen-oriented nation, that Canadians need and deserve a mandate for freedom. Constitutionally expressed, that means that all Canadians should have their rights defined uniformly from coast to coast. You should know that if you're in Quebec or Alberta or BC or wherever, that you have the same rights, obligations, and freedoms under each of those basic systems. And in fact, that's really the only sign that you have that you are a member of the same nation as someone else. If I speak to someone in Quebec and they're under a whole different set of laws than I am here in Ontario, well then, fundamentally, I suppose that means that we live in different countries already. And of course, to have an equality of citizenship, we hear so much about equality, I can't think of any other way to express equality except through individual rights. The minute we have a collective right, we have inequality. That's the very nature of it. It means that a group or a number of individuals who, because they are part of a group, have more rights than others, well, suddenly they're unequal. And I think this is a fundamental thing that we see that many Canadians misunderstand, that somehow if a given number of individuals join a group that they can have more rights than they had before. No, it doesn't work that way. 3 people who get together have the same rights between them that they had individually or in a larger group. And I think it's time that more of us think about this. Another thing we recommended was the elimination of the notwithstanding clause in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This has actually been a major sore point, and it's the fundamental focus, battle between individual rights and collective rights. In effect, when Pierre Trudeau patriated our, quote, Constitution, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, he, in effect, changed Canada's whole legal system. We went from the British common law practically overnight into the Napoleonic civil code type of way of looking at things. Where on the one hand, we're guaranteed fundamental rights and freedoms, but on the other hand, the Charter explicitly allows the government to override those very fundamental rights and freedoms. We should see a limit on taxation on all levels. I mean, when's enough enough? What citizen or what politician could answer to you, what is an unacceptable level of taxation? How high will it go before it's too high? We're already at over 50% of the average Canadian's earnings goes to governments in some way, shape, or form. What protection do we have that it won't be 100% one day? We don't have that protection, and this document is certainly not leading us in the right direction towards having such protection. We should all be in a constitution, which would be ideal in terms of the financial end of things, is a prohibition of deficit financing, a prohibition of censorship, a prohibition of laws that interfere with personal choices and lifestyle, which gets back again to individual rights. And if Quebecers felt confident within the Canadian government that that Charter of Rights and Freedoms would be actually enforced and actually would mean something, I don't be seeing half the problems we're seeing today in terms of everyone wanting to separate. Because the reason people want to separate is because they don't want to be told by somebody else how they have to live their life or who they have to pay for or what choices they should make, especially when that person doesn't even share their interests and may be in a completely different part of the country. And there's no reason why people can't have different interests and be completely disagreeable with one another and still be able to live peacefully and coexist within the same borders, enjoying the same rights and freedoms. So fundamentally, I guess I would say that a constitution should be a guarantee of our protection from our governments. We should not have collective rights enshrined in any such document. We proposed in 1991, more specifically, an amending formula that whenever you want to change anything to the Constitution, it should be easy and simple to understand for all Canadians to understand it. It should effectively limit the power of politicians to control our constitutional destiny, which is, I'll be getting back to the referendum in a moment to get back onto that point. And definitely people should have the final verdict on the change, not just an opinion poll like what we're going through now. It should actually be a binding vote in all cases in terms of, and a very clear vote, in terms of constitutional changes we're talking about here. We also recommended that it should be a majority of 75% of Canadians plus 3/4 of the provinces and territories. And we also suggested that where provincial legislation violates the Constitution must take precedence. And beyond these issues, we also advocated perfect equality on the provincial side of the scale, that each province is equal within Confederation, within the partnership. If you're a partner, you should be treated equally as all the other partners. Which brings me down now to the actual referendum itself. I think the big question I've been asking about the referendum lately, aside from its manipulative characteristics, and I mean there's been all sorts of criticisms that we can levy about the referendum, I think you've heard them all. But the one that's really been on my mind a lot lately is just one question, and that's why? Why have a referendum when first it's not legally binding, it wasn't necessary, and more importantly, when every single of our elected politicians and everyone in government agrees and has told us beyond any measure of a doubt in their mind that unless we vote yes, the country's going to fall apart. And this is such a critical thing to the future of the country that this deal goes ahead. Well, I'll tell you, Pierre Trudeau never gave us any consultation when he repatriated the Constitution, and we've been living with that for 10 years. Now, if our current politicians felt that this was so important and so inviolable and that we shouldn't really tamper with this agreement, why then would they throw it open to a public vote? And why do they want some kind of a vote from us? Or why do they want to hear our opinion on this issue? Because they really don't need it, and if they truly believe that it's important to the future of the country, where is the strength of their conviction? They should go ahead with it, and then we should deal with the consequences. But this is not the way this whole situation has been handled. So rather, I think we're getting set up by this referendum. Politicians are distancing themselves from what I see as being, we're still going to be going through an inevitable economic crunch and social crunch in this country. We've still got major deficits to deal with. We've got a tremendously high tax rate. Our government policies are just scaring business investment and helping us lose jobs in this country at an ever-increasing scale. I see the specter of inflation possibly coming back in the very near future, and Canada's dollar is being propped up constantly. We're really having trouble keeping things as they are. So I think that whether we vote yes or no in this referendum, the politicians will be able to say that whatever happens after, it's our fault. If we vote no, they can say, well, we recommended this, we didn't go for it, and therefore all these bad economic things that happened, what's your fault? If we vote yes, they can similarly say, well, this is what the people wanted. And again, the responsibility falls back on our shoulders. But having said that, and knowing that the referendum itself is not, quote, legally binding, I think there is some strength to the referendum in the sense that this is the first time that voters in Canada have been asked to pick an idea instead of picking a personality. And that, to me, is one of the biggest positive things I can say about this referendum. For the first time in a long time, we're seeing people actually focus on the issue, actually focusing on what kind of country do they want to live in. And I think that fundamentally winds us down to what the actual question we're being asked on Monday will be all about. And that's really, what kind of Canada do you want to live in? What kind of relationship do you want to have with your government? Do you want to be viewed first and foremost as an individual with inalienable individual rights from coast to coast, treated equally with all your fellow citizens, or do you first wish to be viewed by your governments as members of a group, and secondly as an individual, in which case more of your rights will depend on the group to which you belong? I think that's the issue we're being faced with on Monday. And because I think that we should be treated as equal citizens from coast to coast with inalienable rights and protections from our government, I'll be voting no on Monday. I encourage everyone else here to do the same. And that's basically all I've got to say on the Accord itself. And
why, and for, let's say, counselors, school trustees and everything down there, but I'm sure a lot of them, they say, hey, they're worthy of, this amount of increase in pay, you might say, for their jobs that they're doing for serving the community that we live in, right? Mm-hmm. In Canada, I've noticed time and time again, very recently, with school trustees, council, parliament, and I heard about Congress give themselves a big pay raise down in the States sometimes. But here in Canada, you just can't vote for that. Now, why is that?
Well, again, it's ironic. This again, Canada was not a country founded on the notion, as Tom Hopkins constantly reminds us, and he's campaigning for the yes side. Here's where I see a great contradiction. he's always reminding us that Canada was not founded on the American notion of, quote, we the people. That rather Canada is a confederation put together, by politicians. You know, like we the provinces as entities got together. And really, in a lot of ways, having based the country on that premise, we tend to get a little bit more of a top-down philosophy of government. And we've been campaigning against this idea of self-awarded pay increases for quite a while now. In fact, our whole thing about a pay increase for any elected official, I think should be something that should be put before the public just prior to an election. I think another thing you might have noticed is that whenever anybody gives themselves a pay increase, it's just immediately following an election. With still a couple of years to go, so that most people will have forgotten about it. But it's been a tremendous situation here in London. I remember as far back when the PUC voted themselves a large pay increase, and the councillors and the trustees have all gone here, and we've seen a lot of cases in Toronto too. So I think more taxpayers are starting to react. In fact, I was shocked when, what was one group in Toronto, rolled back their 30% pay increase to 3%, just because people protested. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing a lot more of in Canada until we actually have the legal right to make these opinions heard, rather than having to do it through constant political persuasion, if you know what I mean, more in the protest sense, without really having the strength of the vote or the power in those situations.
If I could just add something, I think the difference in attitude between Canada and the United States arises to a considerable extent from the fact that Canada stayed loyal to the monarchy, and the United Empire loyalists came to this part of the world with their loyalty to the monarchy. Now, in a monarchy, sovereignty comes from the monarch down, and the politicians get their power by being technically Her Majesty's or His Majesty's advisors. And of course, under the constitutional monarchy, they become the real wielders of power, but they do it nominally as the advisors of the sovereign from whom power flows. When the Americans, of course, overthrew the monarchy in their country, they have the idea of sovereignty coming from the people up. And this is one of the reasons why the Americans vote on everything.
That's true. I still question whether that's an obstacle to, say, referendums or...
Oh, it's not a legal obstacle.
No, it's not in that sense, and I don't know if that's exactly where the question was coming from originally. But I'd certainly like to see more in terms of true referendums, in which cases, especially on spending, where the people who can participate in a referendum are those who are directly affected by its results, rather than having a referendum where some people's choices can severely affect others without much control on their part. But
I was just referring to the source of
yes.
this tradition, that the Americans had this attitude, having overthrown a monarchy, and of course power had to come from the people who'd overthrown the monarchy.
That's correct.
But in our system, the idea was that we're subjects of the crown, and as a concession to the people over the years, the crown allowed the people to vote for the advisors of the
Well, exactly, and it's been more of an evolutionary process under the crown. And I mean, since the Magna Carta right on down, the citizens have gathered more and more, common law rights in the sense of protection from their politicians and government. And I think in a large way, the Constitution of 1981, too, was a major step backwards from that evolution. And I think we're starting to see some of the results of it, too. Go ahead.
Yeah, in 1982, Quebec did not come into the family of Canada. They didn't sign it, right?
Well, they didn't ratify the actual.
So I'm going to ask two questions. So therefore, if they weren't in the Constitution, how could they evoke the notwithstanding clause? And the second one is that if all politicians took an oath of an allegiance to the people of the country, we would be better off, would we not?
Well, it would certainly be a step in a better direction,
Yeah.
in the sense of the premise on which their allegiance is based. But as to your first question regarding the notwithstanding clause, I don't think it was necessary at the time, and maybe you can correct me, Ken, but it didn't have to be unanimous. They're still subject to the Constitution, even though they might not have ratified it at the time.
Well,
You know, like technically...
what happened, as I recall, in the creation of the Constitution, was that Trudeau was trying to do it without provincial consent, and trying to get the British Parliament to pass the relevant legislation without provincial consent. And the Supreme Court ruled that while this was technically legal, it was contrary to constitutional convention. And that, of course, was a critical point, because the British know that the constitution of the British type is largely convention and not just what is technically legal. So that made it clear that Trudeau could not have got the British Parliament to do what he wanted, so then he had to get the consent of the bulk of the provinces, which he did, but Quebec was left out.
Right.
Does not the OPP stake an allegiance to the government?
Well, yeah, the allegiance here in Ontario was recently changed, yes.
Yeah.
They no longer swear allegiance to Her Majesty's subjects and to protect Her Majesty's subjects from violations of their rights. They now swear allegiance to the state itself, actually.
So as we have,
Canada.
today we have a state police force, right?
Well, according to their allegiance, current allegiance right now, it certainly sounds that way. And there's a number of people within the police forces who are very concerned about that.
So we could really become, with this oath of allegiance to the state, Ray could really evoke a sort of a War Measures Act, you know?
Well, not technically, but
But
I know
something
what you're
like
getting
that.
at, the potential of that kind of thing is there, yeah. Any other questions, comments? Great, okay, well, thanks everyone for showing up. And
I think we should give Bob a hand for being here.
One last question, sir.
Yeah,
I got a relative that got stretched back in old Winnipeg somewhere, Manitoba, right? He was a Métis, distant relative, right? Anyway, I understood there's something in this Charlottetown Accord that recognizes Métis as what? I don't know, are they as a people, as a separate race, or?
well, it's, again, they're also recognized along with the other, quote, Aboriginal groups, although treated separately, as a separate group. What they're trying to do is set up a third level of government for Aboriginal groups, like Section 4C56 talks about the Accord commits governments to negotiate cost-sharing arrangements relating to Métis institutions, programs, and services, which will be very much along the same lines as the Aboriginal one. And what really is going on here, as the Charlottetown Accord spells out, is that this is not really self-government we're talking about. We're getting an externally subsidized government. The provincial and federal governments are basically holding the bag on the whole thing. And you know that old saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And I think that's the situation you're going to find a major friction between Aboriginal Métis groups and the provincial and federal governments who are footing the bill for the things that they're supposed to be doing. So I see that as a bigger problem looming for the Native people. Does that quite answer your question? Or?
I just want to know, historically, how did the Métis get involved anyway? Like, I mean, I realize, okay, the Métis are half-breeds, right? French and Indian, right? Mixed, right? Am I correct in that?
Yeah.
Okay. So what makes them special?
Well, what would make any particular group special? Well, exactly. Every individual should be treated the same, and that's exactly a question a lot of people are going to ask about the Francophones, about the Aboriginals, about any group that gets special status. You know, another issue too is we're sitting here. Section 1(2)(d) commits Canadians and their governments to the vitality and development of official language minority communities throughout Canada. So what is that going to lead to at a certain point in time? You know, and everyone's going to be asking the same question: how come these people can tax me for what they want, but I don't have the same privilege in return? And that's a great question to answer. I don't think there's anything in particular that should make a person distinct or special under law because of their race, national origin, or ethnicity. I don't think these things should be even considerations under law. I think the law should be dealing with people and use one word: individual. And I mean, that's it. We're all individuals, regardless of where we're from or what languages we speak or who we choose to associate with. That's how the law should treat us. And then we wouldn't have questions like that. Hopefully, that would be the future of Canada that I'd like to see.
But Métis consideration sounds very racist, doesn't it?
Oh, it most certainly does. And you know, that's an interesting issue too. We talk so much about how Canada is getting more and more racist. And the funny thing is, personally, I think these comments are coming from the racists, because racism is a very specific thing. Racism is a situation where laws are enacted to either favor or hinder individuals based on their race. Or if you want to call it sexism, it would be based on gender or whatever. Whereas, that's a very far cry from perhaps prejudice or some of the other things that are being called racism. I mean, it's a big difference if the French don't want to associate with the English and want to be separate. It's freedom of association. In another circumstance, we might call it racism, if we want to get political about it. But racism is a political phenomenon. It relates to laws based on race, and sexism are laws that are based on gender. And that's where you really start treating people not differently, not because of who they are, but because of what they are. And that's where every country that's ever tried that has run into some very serious problems. Okay? Great. And on for